In 1981, Frank Miller was approaching his zenith on Daredevil. He had created and boldly introduced Elektra, the assassin, in issue 168. And then she died in Daredevil 181, a mere year later. Her story in those pages was centered around her relationship with the blind crime fighter and how she became Elektra, the mercenary assassin, in the first place. But what about her solo adventures? That's what we were probably all thinking about. Most of us waited until Miller and Bill Sienkiewicz created Elektra Assassin for Marvel's Epic Comics line in 1986 to see a solo Elektra mission. However, Elektra's first published solo mercenary job was in Bizarre Adventures 28, an unsung black and white anthology comic which came out in 1981. Sometime after her initial appearance in Daredevil 168, but before she died at Bullseye's hand. This issue's subtitle is Unlikely Heroes, but the Elektra story is untitled. But at the time, Elektra was unlikely a hero as they come. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Comics Rot Your Brain, the podcast where professional screenwriters talk about the comic books that they love, mostly from the 1980s. I'm your host, Chris Derrick, and my illustrious co-host, Steve Bagatourian, is off putting together something really dope for y'all to listen to next. So this is just going to be a solo episode with me. I'm going to be talking about the very first Frank Miller written and drawn Elektra Nachios, Elektra the Assassin, her very first solo story. And as I said in the opening of this, her first story appeared in 1981 in an anthology magazine called Bizarre Adventures in issue 28. This is it's an interesting story, so I'm just going to sort of like jump in and tell you something. Oh, but before I get into it, I guess, look, I mean, you can get this there's an omnibus that Marvel publishes called the Elektra Omnibus, and that does a reprint of this story that's from Bizarre Adventures. It's only like 14, 15 pages. And although the story didn't have a name, like when it originally came out, apparently in the collected edition, the story is called Cobra, and I'm not sure why. I'll just sort of like go over the story real quickly so you can kind of get a sense of what this is. The first time we see like Elektra do her thing, it opens with this really, really great like splash panel just of her in in an awesome position of threat, of violence, of still sexy allure. And it's with her, and she's holding two sides. It's interesting. I was reading something about this, is that Frank Miller, and some of you probably already know this, but Frank Miller, he based Elektra off of a bodybuilder that he had sort of like seen and, around this time, probably in the late 70s. I don't know her name right now, but I'll see if I can find that out before I'm done with this. So the story begins on like a freighter or some sort of like, a cargo ship in some unknown ocean. It doesn't even give us like a caption of like where we could be. Is it like the Mediterranean? Is it like somewhere in the Caribbean? It's probably somewhere in the Caribbean, or maybe closer to somewhere off of South America, just based upon what the story like eventually becomes. So our first panel is this, this ship, at night, and then there's a guy who's in the radio room, and he's talking about that they've been infiltrated. Like the ship Cobra this is where I get the title from, obviously. The ship Cobra it's been infiltrated by someone, and they're trying to abort a mission. They're trying to abort a mission, a mongoose. And then this guy on the radio, he gets stabbed with a scythe through the chest, lifted up by Elektra. I mean, it's crazy like how strong she's supposed to be, but she lifts this guy up like straight up, like, like Darth Vader style, like the opening of A New Hope, and like drops this guy down on his chest, and then, she's climbing out through this, I know, some sort of access hatch to the top side, and then she's climbing up to the top of like a cargo, like a stack of cargo things, you know, and then she gets hit with like a flashlight. But on the side of it, we're catching this, like on the edge of the panels, we get this countdown, you know, 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, 9. It's going all the way down. And these couple people have gotten her away from her escape. You know, she hits this one guy in the face with a kick, and then she punches another guy in the stomach. Probably, I guess, like she elbows him, you know, so she doesn't kill him, hit him with the side. And then she dives off the boat with someone else in this kind of awesome panel where it's like she and the other guy are in silhouette and they fall off, and then it comes down to 5, 4, 3, 2, and then you know the next page is boom, the whole boat in this really really awesome like the it's a full like length of the panel page, like it's a vertical like length of the page, the ship exploding, and it's got some Kirby crackle within the explosions, and it's I guess it's something that we'll see like Miller do a little later on in his career. And then we catch the boat is on fire, and then we're away from the boat as it's beginning to sink, and we catch Elektra. Her head pops up out of water, and she grabs some piece of debris to help her float. And there's this cool little moment of just the storytelling where she's there like resting, you know, so kind of like breathing in. Then there's a blank panel, completely like white space. The next panel down is Elektra, and the boat has been the debris has been like tilted up at her, so she's lifted out of the water a bit. And then the next panel is a dude with the gun, which is one of the guys that she sort of fought off, I guess. And then you know it's this great close up of her face, and it feels sort of like something he's gonna do later on, you know, with Sin City. This is. I'm gonna get into this in a minute and talk to you about what I think about a lot of what this is, because the whole book is in black and white, and he's using it's black and white, and there's a lot of cross hatching, but there's also like a fantastic use of duotone throughout this, you know. And then she's just like, "Look, man, we got hours, days before we get to land. Are you really gonna like shoot me? Because that's like kind of stupid. Like we can combine our efforts to survive." But although there's a gun in her face, you know, and then she's with this guy, and then he's like, "Who are you? MI6 CIA?" She's just like, "I'm a mercenary." And then, you know, he's like, "That was my ship you sank, you mercenary." And then he goes into this story about he's on this holy mission, you know, to kill someone. And you know, and she's like, "Explain this to me." And he's like, "It wasn't a merchant ship, you know, I told you that, you know." And then he goes in, it's like, you know, he's after this guy named von Eisenbluth. He's a monster, he's a Nazi. You know, it's interesting because, you know, at this time in our history, this is 81, you know, we're not even 40 years, we're 30, what, we're 36 years away from the end of World War II when this story comes out. So it was at a time when there was still like a lot of like hunting of missing Nazis, of people who were part of the high ranking of the Third Reich, and they got out of, you know, Europe, and a lot of them went to South America. I guess it's, you know, some of them ended up in the States, you know, like secretly. You know, there was like where I grew up, there was this guy named John Demjanjuk, and this was in East Cleveland, and there was always this kind of rumor, and I think he got arrested by the Mossad, um, and you know they thought he was the butcher of Treblinka, and like, he was put on trial. They came and got it. You know, he was whatever. He was arrested, extradited, and sent to Israel, and he was put on trial. You know, to see if he was the butcher of Treblinka. Treblinka was one of the death camps in like it might have been Poland. Could have been in like Estonia, or maybe even like Latvia, perhaps even Ukraine. Can't remember what that is. But this guy tells the story. You know, my parents, my sister, like, you know, like they just weren't killed in a concentration camp. This guy named von Eisenbluth, he performed experiments on his family, you know, and he was like, you know, they were barely human once he was finished with them, you know. And he's like, "But I escaped, you know, to spend more than 3 decades, like I said, like 36 years, to find this monster. You know, the only thing that can quell the screams that he can still hear is to kill this guy, you know." And then we get this some really interesting kind of like you know, like ways to let the time pass of them like floating on the waves at night. It's a really cool kind of thing that Miller's doing. Like, it's all with kind of like silhouettes and like it's fully black paneled and this like Miller. This is at a time when he's still drawing and writing Daredevil at this time. This story came out sometime in 81 between like Daredevil like 168 and Daredevil 181, which was basically that was the run. Those 13 issues were the run of the original introduction of Elektra and how she ran through like Daredevil's life throughout those issues. Before she was taken out by Bullseye, and then she was later resurrected by this group called the Chaste, which I think the issue that is a double-sized issue in like Daredevil like 190. I'm pretty sure that's what it is, which is one of the first ever Daredevil issues that I bought. My very first one was Daredevil 200, which has got 201. It's got this issue with Black Widow on the cover, all in the big in the front, like fighting some people, and Daredevil's up in the back with like with a cast on his arm, and I don't know. I was like one of the maybe that was easily one of the first 10 comics I ever bought was that one. But the next thing we know is this cool little like piece of storytelling art. The way that Miller's so good at telling sequentials, it's like we see Elektra and the guy, they look off, and they see the island in the distance, and she's like, okay, so what's gonna happen now? Like she doesn't say anything, but it's just the gun is pointed at her, and then the dude shoots her in the forehead, and she falls off the boat, and then or the debris, and it's this great, again, this cool Miller kind of like a lot of guys do this, but Miller's one of the best at doing this. Like just as a series of these oblong panels that go down, 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 down. We just see bubbles and then bubbles, bubbles. Then there's one we find. It's deep down, and we see like it's an inverse silhouette. It's all white as opposed to black of a woman's body, and she's like sort of like coming to. And then we see the next three panels are these great kind of shots of Elektra, and she's like, she's swimming underwater. It's like, okay, what's going on? You swimming underwater? At least the first one is, but her physique is so much like a woman bodybuilder physique, and it's kind of cool because it's not like overly comicked out. It looks like someone who's been working hard in the gym without steroids, and then the next two panels are these closer, it's like these jump cuts in on Elektra's face, and we cut in on her eyes. Now it feels like maybe these last two, the way they are, it feels like she's at she's on the surface of the water, and then, but maybe she's underwater, because then like the next few pages is the next page is like starts off with black, and then it's like these two guys on the beach, like they're reviving her, they're giving her like mouth to mouth, and then she wakes up, and there's these two guys, and they're like, oh yeah, like we're the sons of the guy named, old man, von Eisenbluth, and she looks, kind of tiny compared to them. These guys look like they're easily over 6 foot, maybe 225 or something like that. And then she kind of tricks them. It's like she uses this kind of like damsel in distress thing, even though she's got, I mean, her clothing looks like, it doesn't look like a soldier, although she does still have that side. These guys like kind of fall for it. She tricks them and saying, hey, I lost my earring, because she sees they have like a dune buggy in the distance, and she's gonna like steal it from them. And it's kind of interesting because at this time, in 81, like where this is sort of like the really beginnings of like of us seeing like the bad girl in comics as a hero, in terms of like, and if you think about most female characters, didn't have the type of agency that Miller like gives Elektra this early in the story. I think this is kind of why it's cool that he did this solo story during the middle of his first introduction of her, and the bold run he did like on Daredevil, because in Daredevil, like everything she does is pretty much, most of it is sort of like her relationship to Matt Murdock. There's a few issues and a few segments and issues where we kind of get like some of her past and how when she first joined the Hand and became part of those ninjas and she had to kill some people and things like that. But it's still sort of all relationship like telling a story that has to deal with how she's interacting with Daredevil, like either as Daredevil or as Matt Murdock. And it's cool to see her in this way, but you also see that it's like, she's able to kind of like take advantage of her, being a woman to trick these guys into doing something that they are, so they can get fooled. And you kind of get a sense of like, well, they probably don't have much experience with women because their dad is like he's a war criminal. He's a Nazi war criminal. So and this sort of like a isolated island somewhere in like the Caribbean or the South Atlantic or what have you. I think it's more the Caribbean because the way these guys are dressed, like they're like in like they're in like speedos kind of thing, and and then she drives off, and then the next panel on the next page at the top is she's in silhouette, and she's about to approach the compound. She jumps down, she like fights a dog, and which is kind of brutal. And then he does a good thing at sort of like jumping time because the guards find the dog, but there's talk, but they go, oh, there's another one they found. So it's sort of like, oh, there's multiple dogs she's killed, you know and then she like sneaks into the house, the compound, and she's in the background. We see a man in the first panel, and it might be the guy that she was on the boat with. It might be him. He's wet, but maybe no, that guy's dead. That guy's dead. Now I look at it, it's the way it's drawn. And she sneaks downstairs. And she hears something off panel. She hears this guy talking, which is the guy who she was driving with. I mean, she escaped the boat with, and then she kind of like sneaks down on, she's going down these stairs into the basement, and then she hears this guy say, "I will hear you scream," and goes, "Bam, bam." It's this great kind of close-up shot of, Elektra's eyes. And then we cut to the Jewish guy whose parents were killed, and he's shot von Eisenbluth, shot him in the kneecaps, standing in front of this guy, and he's like, it doesn't matter if you shot my knees, like, I don't have, like, I can't feel anything in my legs, you know, I just can't feel anything, and he's just sort of like talking, and he's like, I can't remember you anyway, I can't remember what I did, I can't remember like all of this, like he just seems like a pitiful old man, and he's like, oh, he's like, yeah, would you like a bath? Yes, a bath would be very nice. And then the guy, like, he hears Elektra and sees Elektra, and she's standing there, with her sigh out, and he's like, and the Eisenbluth guy's like, oh, that would be nice. She would be nice, nice warm bath. And then, bam, the guy gets shot in the chest from behind, and it seems like this guy named Von Eisenbluth was just faking that he was had dementia and stuff like that. And then he says, it's like, what one of the cruelest things in it's just so cruel. It's cruel back then. It's cruel now. He's like, please forgive an old man's indulgence, Elektra. He was yours to kill, but my pleasures are very few these days, and it's been such a long time since I've shot a Jew. And then it's the revelation that this guy knew that this kid who escaped from his clutches from one of the death camps was coming after him, and that he had hired Elektra to kill this guy. And so she was more not necessarily like a mercenary, not an assassin, but she is mercenary, but she's like a bodyguard, and doing like a preemptive strike kill. That's why this is such a very potent story to read now. And then the last page is she hasn't said anything, just looks at the guy. She walks off. It's this great long panel like of them at the opposite edges of the panel, the old man in the chair, and she's walking off. And then she turns around. And then she looks this guy in the eye. It's this great little use of like that when they would, like he drew a panel, and then I don't want to say he drew it again and copied it because it's not quite the same, but he but it feels like he drew something and then enlarged it in like a Xerox machine or something like that. And then she throws the sign in this guy's chest and just like goes and she's killed this guy right through his heart. Like the blade goes through his heart and everything. And then she just walks off. And that's the end of this story called Cobra. Now, it's a typical kind of like mercenary story. Reminds me of like maybe like a Mac Bolan kind of like those little pulp books or any kind of pulp story that used to come out in like the 60s and 70s. Those things you get that maybe like Robert McGinnis might like draw the cover for. Um, but it's interesting to see his first like story of Elektra, where she as a mercenary who has a code. She has it's like, does she have morals? Does she not? Does she? Because when you meet her in Daredevil, like she's really up to killing people, and she like part of the thing that crossed into the hand. Like I don't remember what issue it was, but it's like she's got to kill like someone she used to know, and like who's tied up and drugged, and she's got to kill someone, and so she's willing to do a lot of you know, crimes, murders and stuff like that. But then she had this moment of like a code of like there's a type of evil that I can't work for. If the way you talk about like killing this Jewish guy who, like you, von Eisenbluth, wiped out his whole family. And now you just wiped out the last person of this. And this guy's maybe in his 40s because he said he was a kid when he was in the camps, and now it's 36 years later, based upon what it is. And so he could still have children. He might still have a wife now, like or kids. Or now that he's killed Van Eisenbluth, like there's a lot that is now like no longer able to happen in terms of like a family line has been cut off. And so that's what but and that's the line that this guy crosses, that Elektra is like, oh, she's got her money, that she can't abide, which I think is kind of cool. We see that she does have this moral compass, that she's not without scruples or empathy. And also because the guy is dead, whose name I don't think we ever got, she can make the right decision about her employers, which is kind of interesting too, because you just want the money as a mercenary, and obviously, her father was killed. I don't think we ever knew anything about her mom. Like perhaps we did in some of the stuff that's happened in the last 20 years when I hadn't read Marvel comics, but but in those early 12 to 13 issues of seeing Elektra, there's not any talk about her mom, like just her dad, who was killed in front of her. So it's interesting that way in terms of a story. But now I just want to sort of talk about the art, because like I said, like Miller, you know, his work is always sort of like this loose quality to it in terms of what it is, but it's not like sloppy at all. It's very much just like I feel there's like always a level of like of energy in his work. Like he really, I think that his sort of like his loose pencils sort of help with that, and I think that's why he's was really good with like Klaus Janson or with Bill Sienkiewicz doing the inks on his work, because it feels like a little more like charged and kinetic, and you need that for this character and what she's doing and things like that. But he uses this duotone throughout this book, because it's black and white, and it's kind of interesting because he doesn't get to use duotone when he's doing Daredevil, maybe a little bit, but he's got the colors. He's got all the colors to help him like tell the story in the way that he wants in the regular book Daredevil. And here's like the duotone tone just helps. It adds dimension. It gives like there's like a really cool like moment on this last page, when the second to last page, when the guy has shot the hunter has shot von Eisenbluth in his knees, and there's really these two cool panels like in the beginning where it's like he's sort of got duotone on him to put him in shadow, and then Miller was something that he went to revisit and did in great effect later in Sin City, where the background is all black, and then the smoke from the gun kind of wisps around and it's in white, And then the next panel is the same thing. It's kind of like smoking up from this guy's gun and going by his face, and it's just like this white smoke, like it's in front, and then the duotone is on the guy's face, which is a really cool way to kind of like just like he's using these illustrative capacities and skill set that you don't necessarily see all the time in comics because they're going to be printed in color, and also because at this time like there wasn't a lot of black and white comics. I mean, might have been Savage Sword of Conan, and there might have been some like reprints of like of older books that were now done in black and white, but very few stuff that was like published by Marvel or DC that was intended for black and white at this time. And this is one of those things. This Bizarre Adventures anthology did that because all the stories in here like are black and white. There's just, but essentially there's like this comic, the art in here doesn't feel like what he was doing in Daredevil at the time, really. It feels like he was like figuring out, like the two guys that she meets on the beach, right? Like the way that they're drawn and some of the panel layouts and just the compositions, it feels closer to what he would do a few years later in Ronin. And I always talk about on the show, and you hear me talk about people who do art, is that there's a different way these artists approach when their main characters aren't wearing superhero costumes. Like the way they got to draw people that look like they're real people, like in real clothing and things like this. And sure, these two guys are just wearing speedos, so maybe they are like, so maybe the skin around them is the skin tight clothing of their spandex costume, but it doesn't feel like that. It feels more like, again, like what I said when what he did in Ronin. And then so it's sort of like a precursor to all the stuff he's gonna do around 7 years later. It just feels like this. Like at the time, we don't know this because we don't know anything that's going to happen in the future. We don't know about Sin City. We don't know about Dark Knight Returns. But the way he's drawing in this does not feel like anything that it doesn't feel like what he does in Dark Knight Returns. It feels like what he does in Ronin, and then it feels closer to what he later did in Sin City. Although he's using the duotone here, which I don't believe he did at all in Sin City. Now it's been over a decade since I've looked at one of those, but maybe even two. But I don't remember him using duotone. It's more just like straight blacks against whites, and a lot of more like expressive kind of like line work to help with uh, the faces and the expressions and the crevices in everyone's faces. I mean, again, like I was saying, like when she's underwater on this is page 9, and she's swimming underwater. The last two panels, he uses that duotone like on the face, like the background is black, that how deep she's underwater, but then the way he's kind of like drawing her, the way he's rendering her face is in this black, is just this with duotone. And again, like when she gets shot in the head, it's like, the background is duotone, and then it's a lighter version of background to show her legs when they're underwater, and her chest is above the water. He does it really great on these two images when they see the land, the little three image, little like the triptych of how he kind of shows that the guy, the killer, and Elektra see the land, and it's like, because it's at night and there's only moonlight, and he's like, how do I make this feel like it's dark, but not like he's not using blacks. He's using blacks to kind of show her hair and show her costume, but he's got the moonlight is where he wants to use white, and then he's now using duotone to kind of like fill in what that is. And it's a really just it's a fantastic kind of masterclass of how just to use black and white, because like a lot of times when people do black and white comics, like later on, when the black and white explosion came across, there wasn't like a lot of use of duotone that I remember. Like obviously we have it in like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but I don't remember seeing any in Concrete when we just looked at that again recently. I don't remember seeing any in or just a very little bit in Mr. Monster. But the way he uses it in this, because it just gives him like a third. It gives him a third kind of like it gives him a third value to work with, a third or fourth value in terms of like he's got the white, he's got the black, and then he's got various shades of gray that he's not having to kind of like micromanage with cross hatching and things like that. Then he can save cross hatching to kind of give like volume like of certain things. Like when he's this big close up of the guy's face who's telling the story, the killer, I mean the guy whose family was wiped out. Like it's great use where the whole skin is his whole face is duotoned out, except for his well, except for like the highlights on his nose where the moon is hitting. Like and then like the color that he uses a couple different types of duotone, like one the color of the eye, another the color of the skin. And so like I said, there's different values he gets from using the duotone that is it's really smart that he's using this. And I don't think I think that at this time we don't know that Frank Miller's is capable of this type of art because we haven't seen it, like all because he's printing in color all the time. And he, I just it might have been like a few issues or a few panels in like Daredevil where he does use duotone, but he has to rely on it like extensively in this story, which I think is great. And like I'm just going back through the pages, and again that the top shot when she's swimming to the debris, like all the water is duotone, so except for the little like the crests of the wave are white, so that way, and then you can kind of see her body underneath the water. Like it's a really cool, smart thing that he's able to do. It just kind of helps with like sell the story, sell where we are, sell the action image. Because if he did this shot and it was colored, I don't know if you would if the colorist like what color is he gonna make that water that's at night, and obviously like the white caps are where the sunlight is the obviously it's where the white is, the waves are hitting, but that's usually white because that's where the sun or the moon is hitting. This is at night, so it's the moon. So it's just I don't know, it's just one cool thing. And like the thing I loved about this is also it's only like 13 pages, 12, 13 pages, and it reminds me of the few. There was like after the first Sin City story came out, the big thing with the white that was, published in Dark Horse Presents and then first connected. Before he started doing like A Dame to Kill For, he put out like one or two little small, like 6 or 8 page little stories that were just like these little moments, like film noir moments. And this has got the like pacing and the pacing and the quick storytelling and the snap morals and the interesting quick reversal. Like the last 2 pages of this, like pow 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 pow, in terms of like, oh, you left, oh right, oh left, in terms of like the emotional weight of the story. It's really exciting to read and see something that's so expertly done. And again, we're in the early 80s when everybody overwrote, like the amount of dialogue you would see in some of these pages, like as we've shown in some of the books we've talked about or we've commented, it doesn't matter if you're a good writer or not, they just wrote a lot. And and Miller uses no dialogue. I mean, pretty much like, it's so smart. No, but it's like, on the first page, he's got like just kind of a setup, like he's like Fox and Mongoose, emergency, emergency. Like do you copy Mongoose? Do you copy? It's like he's like you have to abort this mission, and then it's and then again like I said, this guy gets killed in the first the third panel, fourth panel. Like Miller, he's got this guy wearing jeans, and the way he does the help with the volume control to make the image look like it's got volume. He uses the duotone. It's just like it's a fun thing. I remark on it a lot because I don't think like a lot of people like use duotone ever in mainstream comics. And to me, I thought it was a smart choice to do. And it just it's like a decade later that he comes back to doing black and white, but he decides not to do it. And maybe it's a printing thing. Like maybe it sort of costs extra money to print like that. I know there's like a big story, and Steve and I were going to cover this about like when Miller and Varley did Ronin, like they went up to Canada to kind of like be so specific with how those books were colored, like how the inks were used, what inks they were using in terms of to so that Lynn's colors could be be properly reproduced the way that she wanted them to look, and that Miller like wanted them to look. But they had, it's like that quality control they had to go through and to kind of get like, here's the limits of what we can do within printing with that four color process. And I just kind of wonder, I think that maybe duotone probably kind of like increases the printing costs of anything, because I kind of look at, let me take a quick look at some of the other stories that are in this, and they use duotone, but not. It's not. It's not as. It's not as smart as Frank's. You see it in a few panels. You see it here and there. But it's just like it's just something you. It's just something that you wouldn't do in most comics, because you've got your color, and that's going to give you like the shading that you need, like what's the highlight, what's the core value, what's the shadow, like you've got the color to explain that like for you, you know so I mean, it's interesting, like what Miller tries to do. I'm trying to think of what's this next story. Can't remember what it's called, but yeah, I don't know. It's like what Miller does is pretty amazing. Uh, as he goes through all this, I'm just sort of like going through. I mean, even on like the first page, like he kind of like accentuates her muscles by using these techniques. I'm probably harping on this too much. You guys are probably sick of having me talk about how cool this is, but I don't know if he's the kind of guy who knows how to do the kind of inking with the brushwork the same way that maybe he obviously doesn't know how to do it to the same skill that when he deploys it in Sin City. But he's younger. It's like in those 10 years in between, like doing Ronin and doing Dark Knight Returns. He's increasing his craft in such a high level. Because the storytelling technique in this, also with like Elektra being a cipher, not really saying much, other people talk and talk in front of her, and then she just kind of absorbs it, and then she's making a decision. It's something that he does again later in Elektra Assassin with Bill Sienkiewicz, and but that he's got all this other, like the guy Garrett who's telling that story is so wild. Like there's so much kind of like language in that, and I think that there's only just a little bit from Elektra. Like she's kind of drugged in some of it, and but then she's kind of written it away in all the post Daredevil stuff, even in Daredevil, where she's very sparse with her words. Doesn't want to say a lot. Doesn't want to give up a lot of information about her. Doesn't want to like pontificate like I'm doing now on the world around her. You know, it's just like I think about it like more about, before I kind of close out again, is like how there were so few women with who didn't have power, didn't have augmented powers, who had solo books, or who were granted solo stories. Like I always kind of lament that there wasn't like, like some Black Widow like solo stories in the like more of them in the 70s and 80s. I just remember, she had those two kind of costumes. Like, well, I told you, like the first one I saw in Daredevil 201, like her costume is like this, it's sort of like a dark, not even dark gray, like a 18% gray, or a little darker than that, gray full suit with like a black, like Black Widow like on her chest, and she had like the widow stings were sort of smaller versions, but that's not how she was, originally came out. You guys remember like when she came out in like I guess it was the 60s or maybe the early 70s, like she's in that black uniform, with the blue highlights. She has those kind of like bangs in her hair, which she didn't have in that when she was really cut short, which is maybe closer to what you would do if you were a spy, so no one can grab your hair, and then the widow stings were these big kind of like yellow gauntlets against that, and she had like that gold kind of like belts with like the oval shapes on them, so she felt more like a hero. like than super spy that she was. And those few issues of Daredevil that I'm talking about, she felt more like this cat burglar type of character, like more like a cat woman, like at least the way that that Miller and was like showing how she looked in like Dark Knight, or that that version of her. She's in the all black suit that she sort of began to wear, that we saw again, like what Michelle Pfeiffer showed in the movie, because I don't remember like Catwoman being shown. I guess she wore that gray suit every once in a while too. But it's still Catwoman was a lot more flamboyant too. Like even when they did the Catwoman show, when it was like Julie Newmar and Eartha Kitt, like her suits felt sort of like very, it had that S&M, like Dom kind of like latex kind of, it wasn't latex, but that kind of tight suit, like that leather suit like that. And it was interesting to see how they were kind of like started to move away from that just a little bit with Elektra, particularly Elektra, because first it was like just the red kind of like, I didn't even know like the origin of her costume, like what's that supposed to be? It's not really like the ninjas that from the Hand, and it's not really, and there were female members of the Hand who were in those red suits, and it's not like the Chased either, like Stick and Shaft and Blade and stuff like that, because they were just ninjas too, but their uniforms were white, and she just had this, that Scully cap that was kind of tied around, and I just don't know what Miller was thinking when he created that. Like, what was the inspiration for that? I mean, it's dope. It's really dope, but it just doesn't fit with where she's coming from. Maybe it's just her own way of trying to be like, I'm gonna look cool, and also if I kill you and kind of dip out, like if I'm doing crimes in like the East, then maybe I don't know, you wouldn't want to show so much skin. I don't know. It's interesting. It's just it's kind of weird to think about like how you know he came up with this character at this time, and then how he was like like exploding her. Sorry, exploiting her, but like trying to exploit her. Um, yeah, it's just like I just don't feel that he got enough usage out of her in that Daredevil story, and maybe that's why he did this story. Because you kind of write this assassin, and you're like, what does she do before she comes back to Hell's Kitchen? And and she's kind of explaining stuff, and like when she's got no interaction with Daredevil, she's got to be doing something to make a name for herself. And ultimately, like, what does she do at the end of this? She like, kills her employer, so no one really knows, you know, what she did and who she betrayed. Obviously, she left the Psy there, so she's sort of messing up as a killer, because now everyone knows you can't trust Elektra as the assassin, because she might kill you if you hire her. But who knows why he did it that way? I would have liked to have seen her like retrieve that Psy. So, but maybe that's just what he's not doing. Just whatever, it's 12 pages or 13 pages. But it is really cool, the little final shots, like that final, like the panel's all white, except, it's kind of like in thirds, and it's two-thirds of it is white and a third of it is black. She's walking out of there, well, and just looks exhausted, um, and beat, but also kind of like morose and, introspective, which is maybe not what you expect from an assassin, but and a mercenary at all. Like like you have to kind of put to kind of put that kind of those thoughts, you had to compartmentalize them. But she like had lied. I just, it's been such a long time since I've have shot a Jew. And it's this kind of the look in this guy's face, like there's like a sense of like uh nostalgic satisfaction is on his face as the gun kind of smokes. And again, like I said, they use the white smoke, with no kind of cross hatching in the smoke at all, no kind of swirls, like none of that Todd McFarlane type of stuff. It's just like white, against like a like a white against a black background. And yeah, it just, I kind of just, I don't know. Everyone's got a lot to say about Miller. Like, what is his politics, and do his politics really affect our ability to um, appreciate his work? And is he misogynistic? I don't know. I mean, like maybe you look at that when you look at what he did to Karen Page in Born Again, but not really, because no, that happens. Like what women get involved with in porn and they get shot up with drugs and to keep doing it. Like we know that happens. That's it's a terrible thing that happens in life to depict it in a comic book. I don't think makes you misogynistic because he doesn't glorify it. And he doesn't revel in it, and he doesn't do anything in here where she's not beat up in a way where it feels like too perverse, or too mean spirited. She always has the upper hand. Yeah, it's kind of cool. Like, oh, this is a cool story. I recommend you go get it. Like I said, it's in that Electro omnibus, and yeah, so I guess that's it for Bizarre Ventures 28. Don't forget to hit like, comment, and subscribe if you're a fan of this show. We'll be back in a week or two with something super exciting that you won't expect. Don't forget to sign up for our Patreon at patreon.com/comics rot your brain. It's been like a little lax the last 4 or 5 months. Steve and I have been kind of caught up with doing like a bunch of writing to make some money as career screenwriters as Hollywood implodes. But we're trying to get these episodes out. We're trying to get a few more kind of cool like interviews for you guys. If you haven't listened to the interview that we did with Ladrone about a month or two ago, please check that out on the channel. And I guess that's it. Thank you for listening. Steve and I will be back shortly, and have a good day.